My job really is to go briefly through the actual assessment framework which the team has been assembling over the last few years to respond to the challenge that all of you practitioners out in the land of local governments face on a day-to-day basis. And I also thank the many participants from the communities across BC whom I've had the pleasure of speaking to. Just listening to the discussions this morning from all of the speakers, I think I would be able to speak on behalf of all of us and say that the issue at hand is complicated, and it ranges from anything from what Rob is talking about, which is bordering on quantitative and Cartesian decomposition analysis, counting tons of greenhouse gases, all the way along the spectrum to much more qualitative and subjective measurements about multi-level governance and the like. And so our job was really to create a tool that would help move the agenda along and help local governments understand where they're at in terms of climate action and what would be useful avenues to pursue. And I wanted to just start with some of the assumptions that we had around making this assessment framework. And I noticed recently in a report by the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations out of Paris on their deep decarbonization work. And they talked about the need by 2050 for all human beings, in fact, to reduce their emissions to 1.7 tons per capita per year. In terms of Canada today, we're at around 21 tons per capita per day. And on this next slide, you can see the challenge, I suppose, in terms of where we will likely be in terms of Canadians' emissions in 2050 in the gray section of the chart on the left, and under a deep decarbonization pathway down to roughly 78 megatons, so much, much less by 2050, and how that really translates into us reducing our per capita emissions, just to give you sort of an idea of the magnitude of the challenge. And the point that we've really, in this team, have come to feel very strongly about is that the local governments are deeply implicated in the emissions of the individual. But local governments are certainly not the only actors, and that local governments themselves and the communities they are involved with are part of the system of systems that drive the inertia of unsustainable development paths. And again, this idea of development paths has come very much to the fore in our work in the Meeting the Climate Change Challenge project, in that we realized it's not simply a challenge of figuring out how many kilometers of bike paths or how many solar panels to install in the community, but more a question of understanding the nature, the relationships within the underlying development path, and looking for ways to intervene in that. As John was saying earlier, and Anne was saying forcefully about the need to intervene in development path trajectories. And so we know that local governments have quite potent capacities to control land use, zoning, development permits, maybe adjusting or interpreting building codes, infrastructure investments, a whole raft of things that local governments as institutions can do to impact on the emissions profile of the community. And again, reiterating what I was saying a moment ago about how complex the challenge is, the project team really wrestled with an appropriate set of theoretical frames to deploy to understand the nature of these development paths and the nature of the local government challenge around how to identify what is and is not useful in terms of a climate action, and what initiative will materially shift the development paths we're on. And I think it's useful just to revisit the idea of development path quickly. Anne read out the definition that Sathe et al. In 2007 had come up with in terms of development path, but the work of Burch and company in 2014, John and Anne are apart, came up with what I believe is a much more comprehensive understanding of what constitutes a development path. And the project team understands development paths as operating at the scale of socio-technical system and systems of governance, and that these systems consist of social systems, and these are importantly formal and informal rules, motivations, rationalities, and norms. And they also involve networks of actors, diverse technologies, materials, and importantly, ecological systems. The development path is really an emergent property of a system, deeply imbued with values, norms, rules, and principles, rather than a measurable set of conditions and characteristics. And they exhibit a particular set of interlinking regime rules and behavior and cascading effects over time. And all of these are reinforced at multiple levels with varied capacities. So I bring your attention to that because if we really are interested in understanding and maybe even intervening in development paths, trajectories, and their nature, then what tool set would we deploy to do so? And this is where I draw your attention to 4 bodies of literature: the sustainability transitions and transition management literature, the social practice or theories of social practices literature that's promoted extensively by the work of Shove, Shatsky, Reckwitz, Sutherland, and others, and also the renowned work of Halling on socio-ecological systems and adaptive management frameworks. And obviously the development path work. This is all very important for understanding how and where to intervene in this riddle. And broadly speaking, the sustainability transitions or the transitions literature emphasizes the multiple levels, multiple actors that are interacting simultaneously across scales, across spatial and temporal scales to produce effects. And that these effects are the vital ingredients, if you will, of complex socio-technical systems that involve not only technologies and infrastructures, but also social norms and human actors. And then social practices helps us by decentering the individual or the actor, the individual actor, and instead putting our focus on the things that we as actors do, oftentimes without knowing that we're doing them and not being able to articulate necessarily what we're doing. And this is important because it implicates norms, cultures, historical contextualizing factors, are the spaces and places we occupy, the infrastructures that we inherit and we assume to be normal, and ultimately contribute to the way we realize our daily lives. So we've got the system effect, we've got individuals accounted for through our social practices framework, and then the socio-ecological systems. Adaptive management brings into the fore the necessary and obligate relationships between the systems of the biosphere that we all rely on, all the way down to the riparian zones around the creeks and streams that flow through our communities, back to we as humans, our institutions, and our daily lives. And then, as I've already spoken about development paths, but this is, in a way, the development path fuses together the first 3 literatures, one way of at least looking at them together. So the design of the assessment framework is meant to respond to the realities of local governments, and local governments, as we know, in British Columbia and really across Canada for that matter, are interested with planning, governing, setting policy, also delivering services to their local inhabitants based on the priorities and the visions of the council and local interests. And then the third thing that local governments concern themselves is with their own operations. They could be, simply maintaining City Hall, but they could also involve fleets or building docks. So the assessment framework includes 34 indicators, and these were derived from Phase 1 and Phase 2 interview responses and transcripts. So this was from 2012 and then again in 2016. We spoke to a lot of you, trying to get your personal lived experiences codified so we could understand what was your reality. And we also looked at OCPs, staff reports, and strategic plans, be they for waste or transportation or energy or buildings. And we also looked at existing sets of indicators. There's a literature on indicators best practices, the Global City Indicators Facility, Urban Climate Change Research Network, the Fraser Basin Council has done some work on this line, Sustainable Prosperity, and all these indicator sets we're looking at specifically that dealt with climate change, not just sustainability, but there was obviously an overlap with sustainability indicators as well. And in fact, the sustainability indicators were useful because they push us in that direction of flexing, I suppose, intellectually and understanding that we're dealing with a complex, simultaneously interacting systems and not simply quantitative measures that a lot of other data frameworks they've relied on. And so what I find interesting about the assessment framework is that rather than having a whole slew of categories that deal with rather objective categories about that you can easily quantify, they're mostly qualitative. And we've divided the assessment framework into agenda setting strategies. These are the themes or categories that would apply to the local government institution, policy planning and formulation of those plans, the implementation of policies and plans, feedback, monitoring, and evaluation of plans and policies, the dissemination of best practices and the results of climate work, and then lastly, actual greenhouse gas emissions feature in the assessment framework. But I think importantly, they are the last of all 6 categories. And the way the tool is designed to function is open to appropriation, quite frankly. We have made some tweaks to make it more accessible to hopefully yourselves as practitioners, something that you can use in your work to help you understand either where you are in your climate action journey or where you want to go. And as I mentioned, these indicators and the categories and the ideas we're talking about break away from traditional indicator sets that, as I said, focus on things like bike lanes and number of e-vehicles on the road and such. And instead, we've made an honest effort to reorient or redefine, I should say, reproblematize the climate action challenge for local governments, and to highlight how interdependent the role of the actions of the government are with other levels of government, community groups, with ecological system feedbacks, the vital nature and importance of multi-level governance, as Anne was saying before, policy coherence, the growing need for creative, innovative partnerships with unusual suspects from all sectors, the multi-scalar aspects of the climate change challenge, and the jurisdictional contestations and overlaps and synergies that have to be taken into consideration. The role of experimentation as a strategy to buffer communities from shocks, to literally maintain a constant set of options on the table around potential actions going forward, the need to be adaptable and flexible, and the highly emergent nature of the work of local governments, local communities themselves. Visions are emergent. They often come from unexpected places, as John was just mentioning when he was asking Rob about the unintended consequences and co-benefits. Sometimes we cannot predict what will happen, and the way people construct their realities and interpret density is vitally important, because we might have an idea about what a sustainable future looks like, but in the end, it won't be really us who decides. It'll be the population, hopefully following some gentle nudging. The tool hopefully will function to permit a broader exploration of the evidence of reconfigured rules, norms, and habits, arrangements, normal ways of doing things at local governments in the context of climate actions. It definitely tries to account for the complexity of local government realities, the very real issue of the immediacy of issues, whether it's forest fires that pop up one time of year, just as the need to clear drains from falling leaves in the fall comes up, or snow removal. The difficulty of dealing with subjective qualitative issues when you've only got a limited access of quantitative data. The oftentimes fluid, fuzzy, and political priorities that face local governments, cross-scale interactions with other levels of government or supranational organizations, even in the case of the IPCC, and the importance of engaging with multiple stakeholders. And the idea is that using this assessment framework, we will better understand the nature of change and hopefully understand sort of an indication of what is happening at the local government level is contributing to incremental, transitional, or indeed transformative change. And that the framework may be effective at revealing evidence of changes in the rules or the logics of local governments when they do planning or infrastructure investments or what have you. And I suppose the holy grail at the end of the day is to ideally be able to understand those initiatives that are underway right now that will take us in useful directions and those that will not. And I should just highlight that the work by Loorbach and Kemp and others in Holland on transition management is interesting, because they've been pioneering the possibility of actively intervening in development path, structure, and form, and ultimately direction. And the conclusions that they've come up with is that while noble and exciting, one cannot underestimate the unintended consequences of meddling in a system, and that sometimes surprising effects are felt when you start to meddle with using policies to steer the community in a certain and particular prescribed direction. But far from saying don't intervene, they are still saying it's meritorious to try to nudge in a certain direction, but also and always be open to reassessing, adapting, flexing, and adjusting to the local realities. So we've been through the assessment framework in the past, but it is, as I said, divided into 6 categories. There are 34 indicators, and moving from left to right, as the colors become more intense, we're moving from what we would loosely describe as business as usual or incremental change, something that won't very well in light of the recent IPCC report that calls for quite dramatic action in 12 years. So the impetus to move toward the right-hand side of this framework and to see evidence of transformative actions and strategies is definitely upon us. And I don't know how much detail I should go into at this point, except to say that the way the framework can be used is each of these columns, the 3 columns on the right, can paint a picture that in an ideal world, a local government agent could identify with or not. And as we go into this afternoon session, I'm hoping that to get feedback from you, the folks who actually deal with the immediate issues of local communities, as to how real and representative these scenarios are, or you think they could be, these pictures that have been painted by each of these indicators, so to speak.